Margaret Ellis picked up her own suitcase before Thomas Whitaker even moved to help her. She had seen his face the moment she stepped off that stagecoach, the way his jaw went tight, the way his eyes dropped once and didn't come back up, the way he looked at his foreman, like a man who had just realized the deal he made was not the deal he wanted. She had seen that look her entire life. She was 32 years old, and she was done pretending it didn't happen. If this story speaks to something you've carried a long time, I want you to stay with me every single part of it. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And I promise you, by the time we reach the end, you will understand why Margaret Ellis was never the problem. Now let's begin. Margaret Ellis had not cried on the stagecoach ride into Whitaker territory, and she was not about to start now. She had done her crying back in Missouri, back in the small boarding house room where she'd packed everything she owned into one battered leather suitcase, and told herself that a new life in Montana was worth whatever waited at the end of a 3-day ride. She had let herself feel every bit of the fear, then the uncertainty, the loneliness, the quiet voice in her chest that whispered she was making a terrible mistake. She had sat with all of it through 2 long nights and 1 gray dawn, and then she had set it aside, the way she set aside everything she couldn't afford to carry, and she had gotten on that coach. That was the thing about Margaret. She knew how to put things down. She had been doing it since she was a girl. When she stepped off the stage in front of the Whitaker Ranch, the July heat hit her like a flat hand. Dust rose from the road in small, lazy spirals. There were 3 ranch hands standing near the fence, and they had all stopped what they were doing. A man in a gray hat stood slightly apart from the others, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something severe and unreadable. He was watching her with an expression she recognized the way you recognize weather, not by thinking, but by the way your skin reacts before your mind catches up. He was Thomas Whitaker. She knew it without anyone saying so, and she knew what he was thinking without him saying that either. She picked up her own suitcase before he even moved. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. His voice came back flat and controlled. "Miss Ellis, I reckon the ride made me a little dusty," she said, because she had learned a long time ago that the fastest way through an uncomfortable silence was to walk straight through it. "Is there somewhere I can wash up before I have a look at the kitchen?" Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, more like confusion, the look of a man who had prepared himself for a particular kind of conversation and was suddenly holding a script that didn't match. "Henry," he said to the older man beside him, "show Miss Ellis to the house." He did not offer to take her bag. She did not wait for him to. The ranch hand named Henry Dawson was a weathered man in his late 50s with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen enough of the world to be careful about what they let show. He fell into step beside her without comment, and Margaret was grateful for that. Some kindnesses were just silence at the right moment. "Kitchen's through the back," Henry said as he pushed open the front door. "Thank you." She stepped inside. The house was not what she'd imagined. She'd imagined neglect, and neglect was there plain enough, but what she hadn't anticipated was the particular quality of the silence. It wasn't the silence of a place that had never been lived in. It was the silence of a place that had stopped. Like a clock someone had forgotten to wind. There were small signs everywhere. If you knew how to read them, a woman's curtain hanging slightly crooked at the window never straightened. A hook near the door with nothing on it but a faint ring of dust where something had hung for years. A crack in the kitchen wall that someone had started to patch and then simply hadn't. Margaret set her suitcase down near the door and walked into the kitchen. She stood there for a long moment, not saying anything. The pantry was a disaster. Flour stored wrong, going stale. Salt mixed in with the sugar from a bag that had torn and been poorly folded shut. Dried beans scattered loose across a shelf that had never been properly swept. Cured meat hanging in a corner that was getting too much light. She opened a cabinet and found rusted tins stacked 3 deep, half of them unlabeled. Behind her, Henry cleared his throat. "I know it ain't much," he said. "We had a woman come in twice a week for a while after Mrs. Whitaker passed, but she stopped coming last winter and nobody—" He paused. "Nobody quite filled in." "How many men are you feeding?" Margaret asked. "7 most days, sometimes 9 if the seasonal hands are on. Breakfast and supper both. Breakfast mostly, supper when we can manage it." She turned around and looked at him. "When's the last time anyone managed a real supper, not just biscuits and salt pork, an actual meal?" Henry's expression told her everything before he opened his mouth. "Mrs. Whitaker's been gone 3 years, ma'am." Margaret nodded once. "All right." She pulled her sleeves up and reached for the broom that was leaning crookedly against the wall, and she got to work. Henry watched her for a moment. Then quietly he left. She didn't mind. She preferred it actually the space to move through a new place without being watched, to take it apart in her mind, and understand its logic before she started putting it back together. She swept the floor first because you had to start with what was underneath everything. She found a bucket, filled it from the pump in the yard, and scrubbed the countertops until the wood stopped being gray and started being brown again. She reorganized the pantry shelf by shelf, pulling everything out, checking every tin and bag, lining things up in an order that made sense: dry goods by use, preserved food by date, staples up front, and specialty items behind. It took 2 hours. By the time she finished, she had a clear picture of what she was working with, and it was not as bad as it had looked. There was real food here. There was enough, if you knew what you were doing, to feed 9 men a proper meal. She started on supper. She had leftover beef that she trimmed and cut small, and got into a pan with rendered fat and onion until the smell changed, until it stopped being raw and started being something else entirely, something that would pull a man in from 50 feet away. She added dried beans she had soaked that afternoon, a handful of the herbs she'd dried and brought from Missouri in a small cloth pouch, and a pot of cornbread with a crackled top that she slid into the oven like she was finishing a sentence. She was rolling the second pan of biscuits when she heard boots on the back porch. She didn't look up. A moment of silence. Then a voice, young, sharp, carrying that particular edge that belonged to a man who wasn't sure whether he wanted to be funny or mean, and had decided to try both at once. "Well, I'll be. She can cook least." Low laughter from somewhere behind him. Margaret pressed the biscuit cutter down, turned it, lifted it clean. She still didn't look up. "What's your name?" she asked. A pause. He hadn't expected to be asked. "Caleb Foster," he said. "Caleb." She set the biscuit down on the pan, neat as a button. "If you've got opinions about my cooking, you're welcome to eat somewhere else tonight. If you're hungry, supper's at 6, and you'll sit down like a decent man." She picked up the cutter again. "Your choice." Silence. Then the boots retreated across the porch, and she heard muffled arguing outside, low voices, and finally quiet. Henry Dawson appeared in the kitchen doorway 10 minutes before 6, with his hat in his hands and an expression Margaret could only describe as cautious respect. "They'll all be sitting down, ma'am," he said. "Good. Can you tell Mr. Whitaker supper's ready?" A beat. "He knows." She found out later that Thomas Whitaker had been standing on the far side of the yard for the better part of an hour, not because he had anything to do there, but because the smell coming from his kitchen was doing something to him that he didn't know how to name and wasn't ready to sit with. He came to the table last. The men were already seated, 7 of them rough-handed and uncertain, fidgeting with their silverware in a way they wouldn't have if they'd been comfortable, which told Margaret they weren't. They had been eating whatever they could throw together for 3 years, and the habit of a proper meal table had gone out of them. She put the food down without ceremony. Beef, beans, cornbread, biscuits with butter she'd found sealed in a crock in the cold cellar, preserved green beans with a little vinegar and salt that cut through the richness of everything else. The men went quiet when they tasted it. Not polite quiet. Not the silence of men holding back opinions. The genuine silence of people who had just been surprised. Caleb Foster was staring at his plate like it had said something to him. Old Henry closed his eyes for a moment, just a second, just long enough that Margaret noticed, and when he opened them, he reached for a second biscuit without looking at anyone. Thomas Whitaker sat at the head of the table and ate with the focused private attention of a man who was working very hard not to let anything show on his face. He ate steadily through the whole meal. He did not speak. When he finished, he set his fork down, and the sound of it was small and precise in the quiet room. He looked at Margaret, who was standing near the stove because she had not sat down. She never sat with the family in houses where she worked an old habit she had carried without examining it. "That was a fine meal, Miss Ellis," he said. His voice was careful, like he was picking up something fragile. "Thank you," she said. "You've been cooking for large groups?" "Yes, sir, most of my working life." He nodded once. A long pause. The kitchen was in poor shape. "It's workable," she said. "Give me a week and it'll be better than workable." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, not quite apology, something in between. "I'll leave you to it then." He pushed back from the table, picked up his hat, and walked out. He didn't say anything else to her that night. She didn't expect him to. She'd been hired for a job and she had done the job, and that was the nature of the arrangement. She washed the dishes alone in the quiet kitchen, while the sound of men's voices drifted in from the bunkhouse, not mocking anymore, just talking the low, easy talk of men who had been fed and were at rest, and she scrubbed the last pan and set it on the rack and dried her hands on a cloth. She looked out the small window above the sink. Montana night was enormous. Stars like she'd never seen in Missouri, dense and close, like the sky was made of something different here. She was not loved. She was not wanted in the way she had once a long time ago allowed herself to hope for. She was here to work, and she had worked, and she would work again tomorrow. But the ranch hands had eaten. The kitchen was clean. The pantry made sense. And somewhere out there, Thomas Whitaker was walking across his own yard, and she would bet her last dollar he was thinking about what he had just eaten, trying to remember the last time food had tasted like something other than fuel. That was something. It was not everything. But it was something, and Margaret Ellis had built a whole life out of somethings. She picked up the lantern, walked to the small room at the back of the house that Henry had shown her, set her suitcase against the wall, and sat down on the edge of the narrow bed. She did not open the suitcase. She never opened it until she was sure she was staying. She was not sure yet. She lay down in her dress and stared at the ceiling and listened to Montana in the dark. And eventually, despite everything, the dust, the exhaustion, the weight of Thomas Whitaker's careful, disappointed face, she slept. 3 days later, Caleb Foster asked her with the particular stiffness of a young man attempting sincerity, if she could teach him how she got the cornbread to come out with that crust. She looked at him for a moment. "You have to let the pan get hot first," she said. "Most people put the batter in before the pan's ready. You do that, it steams instead of sears. You want it to sear." He nodded, chewing on that like it was more than a cooking lesson. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He never mocked her again. By the end of the first week, the kitchen had been fully overhauled. The pantry shelves were organized and labeled. The waste that had been quietly rotting in corners was gone. Margaret had started a ledger for supplies, what came in, what went out, what they needed and when. Because she'd found the ranch was hemorrhaging money on food that went bad before anyone used it, and she was not willing to let that continue. She brought the ledger to Henry because Henry was the one who managed the daily operations of the ranch, and she set it on the table in front of him. He studied it for a long moment. "Where'd you get these numbers?" he asked. "From what we used this week versus what was spoiled when I arrived." Henry looked up at her. "You're saying we've been spending near double what we need to." "Close to it. Maybe not double, but a third more than necessary for certain." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas needs to see this." "I was going to ask if you'd take it to him," she said. "I don't know yet how he likes information brought to him." Henry considered that. "He likes it straight. No cushion." "Then maybe I'll bring it myself." Henry nodded slowly. "Maybe you should." She knocked on the door of Thomas Whitaker's study that evening after supper, ledger in hand, her heart doing something careful and steady that she refused to call nerves. "Come in," he said. He was sitting at a wide desk covered in papers, his jacket-off sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking like a man who had been fighting with numbers for hours and was not winning. He looked up and something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the beginning of something she couldn't fully name. "Miss Ellis, I'm sorry to disturb you," she said, and stepped in and put the ledger on the edge of his desk. "I've been keeping track of the kitchen supplies since I arrived. I found some patterns you might want to know about." He looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He pulled the ledger toward him and began reading. The room was quiet for a long time. Outside, a nightbird called once and went still. The lamp on his desk burned low and steady. Thomas Whitaker turned pages with the focused attention she'd noticed at supper, that same quality of giving something his full regard, like he was the kind of man who didn't do anything halfway. He closed the ledger. "You kept this in a week," he said. "Yes, sir." "Henry didn't ask you to?" "No." He was quiet. "Why?" Margaret looked at him directly. "Because waste bothers me, and because you hired me to manage this household, and I can't manage something I don't understand. So I learned it." A long pause. "My wife used to say that," he said, quietly, like he hadn't meant to. Margaret didn't say anything. Thomas picked up the ledger again and set it beside his own papers. "I'll go over this. Thank you for bringing it." "Of course." She stood to leave. "Miss Ellis?" She turned. He looked at her with that careful, unreadable expression. She was starting to learn the face of a man who was used to keeping his own counsel and was finding it perhaps slightly less useful than he'd thought. "The men are eating better," he said. "They're working better for it." She nodded. "That matters," he said. "To this ranch." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." She walked out of the study and down the hallway and back into her kitchen, which was clean and quiet, and smelled faintly of the cornbread from supper, and she stood at the counter for a moment with both hands flat on the cool wood. He noticed. He had noticed the work and the results of the work and had said so without being asked. That was not love. That was not even close to love. But it was the first time in this house that she had felt not just useful, but seen. Partially. Tentatively. The way you might begin to see something in the dark when your eyes are still adjusting. It was enough for now. It was enough to stay. She reached under the counter and pulled out her flour, and she began prepping for tomorrow's breakfast, and she let herself, just for a moment, feel the small, firm fact of it. She was still here. The suitcase was still unpacked. But for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach into the unforgiving Montana dust, she thought maybe, just maybe, she might open it soon. The morning after Thomas Whitaker walked out of his own study with Margaret's ledger tucked under his arm, she was up before dawn. Not because she had to be, because she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the ranch breathe the creak of the bunkhouse, settling the distant sound of a horse shifting in its stall, the low moan of wind coming down from the mountains. And she thought about the way Thomas had said that matters to this ranch, like he was being very careful to attribute the thing he felt to the ranch and not to himself. She understood that kind of carefulness. She had practiced it herself. She got up dressed in the dark and went to the kitchen. There was something clarifying about a kitchen before anyone else was in it. The world was very simple at 4 a.m. You had heat, you had cold, you had what needed doing, and the time to do it. Margaret built the fire in the stove, up from the banked coals she'd left the night before, and put a pot of coffee on, and started on breakfast biscuits, while the sky outside the window went from black to the particular dark blue that comes just before the gray. She was working through her second batch when she heard the back door. She didn't turn around. "Coffee's ready," she said. A pause. Boots on the floor. The sound of a chair being pulled out at the kitchen table, not the dining room table, where the men ate, the small table near the window, where she'd taken to sitting in the evenings when the work was done. The sound of a cup being poured. Silence. She worked the biscuit dough, folded it, pressed it flat. "You're up early," Thomas Whitaker said. "So are you." Another silence. She pressed the cutter down, turned it, lifted it clean. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Me either." She didn't elaborate, and neither did he, and there was something almost comfortable about that, two people occupying the same quiet without demanding anything of it. Margaret had not had that with very many people in her life. She'd spent most of her years in spaces where her presence required constant justification, where she had to earn the right to simply exist in a room by being useful, by being pleasant, by making herself easy to accommodate. The stillness here in this kitchen, at this hour, with this man she barely knew, sitting at the table behind her, it was strange. It was unexpectedly easy. "The numbers in that ledger?" Thomas said. "Yes. I went over them last night." She kept her hands moving, setting biscuits on the pan. "And you were right about the waste." He set his cup down. "You were more right than I was ready to hear, I think." She turned at that because she wanted to see his face when he said the next part, and she was not disappointed. He was looking at this table. There was something in his jaw that suggested the admission had cost him something, not a man accustomed to being wrong, or at least not accustomed to saying so. "We've been losing money I didn't know we were losing," he said. "Not a fortune, but enough that it's made the last 2 winters harder than they had to be." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and came to sit across from him. Not because she'd been invited, because this was a conversation that deserved to be had face to face. "The problem wasn't carelessness," she said. "Whoever was managing supplies before was doing their best without a system. When there's no system, things fall through. It's not about blame." Thomas looked up. She held his gaze. "Still," he said. "Yes," she said. "Still." He looked at her for a long moment, the way you look at something when you're trying to decide what category it belongs to, and it keeps refusing to fit. "I'll put Henry in charge of ordering," he said finally. "He comes to you first." "That'll work?" "All right." He picked up his cup. "All right." She went back to the stove, slid the biscuits in, and they finished the morning in silence. That was no longer quite the same silence as before. It had shifted. Just slightly. The way a door shifts when someone leans against it from the other side, not open, not yet, but no longer fully closed. The trouble started that same day, just after noon. It came in the form of a buckboard pulling into the yard carrying a woman in a blue dress and a man Margaret didn't recognize, though she recognized the type immediately. The kind of man who wore his authority in his posture, who tilted his chin a certain way to signal that he expected the world to arrange itself around him. He was perhaps 50, well-fed, wearing a coat that was too fine for ranch country, and boots that had never seen real mud. Margaret was coming from the cold cellar with a crate of preserves when the buckboard stopped. She set the crate down and watched. The woman in the blue dress climbed down first. She was handsome, dark-haired, with the careful beauty of someone who maintained it deliberately. She looked at the house first, then swept her gaze across the yard, and when her eyes landed on Margaret, something happened in them, a small, precise contraction, like a window shade being pulled. "That must be her," the woman said, not quietly. The man had climbed down by then and was scanning the yard for Thomas. "Thomas," he called out. "Tom, you in there?" Thomas came from the direction of the barn hat in hand, and his face when he saw the man did something complicated. "Gerald," he said, "heard you got yourself a bride." Gerald Sloan said loud enough that the ranch hands near the fence could hear every word. He clapped Thomas on the shoulder with the familiarity of a man who believed closeness was something you could install on yourself by acting like it was already there. "Had to come see for myself. My wife near dragged me out here." He laughed. Elaine Sloan did not laugh. She was still looking at Margaret. "Is that her?" Elaine said to Thomas. Her voice was pleasant, precisely pleasant the way a blade is precise. Thomas looked at Margaret. Something moved across his face that she had learned by now to watch for that brief internal weather change before the controlled expression settled back into place. "Miss Ellis," he said carefully, "these are the Sloans. Gerald's family runs the Twin Creeks spread to the north." Margaret came forward, wiping her hands on her apron, and extended one. "Mrs. Sloan, Mr. Sloan." Gerald Sloan shook her hand with the automatic politeness of a man who shakes everyone's hand out of habit. Elaine Sloan touched her fingers for exactly 1 second. "My goodness," Elaine said with the warmth of a woman wielding warmth like a tool. "What a surprise." She glanced at Thomas. "Your advertisement said simple countrywoman. I suppose that's accurate. The yard went quiet. Not the sudden crashing quiet of an explosion, but the creeping quiet of something dropping slowly into still water, the ripple spreading out until it reached every edge. Margaret stood very still. In the space of those 3 seconds, she made a decision she had made many times before she decided not to give Elaine Sloane the reaction she was angling for. "Will you stay for supper?" Margaret said. Her voice was even unhurried. "I'm putting together a beef stew that'll be ready around 6. You're welcome to it." Elaine blinked. She had expected tears, or stiffness, or the particular crumpling that happened when you landed a blow and the other person couldn't absorb it. She had not expected an invitation to dinner. Gerald Sloane, who had been watching the exchange with the focused interest of a man who understood exactly what his wife had just done and was relieved to have it sidestepped, said, "That's generous of you, Miss Ellis. We might just take you up on it." "Wonderful," Margaret said. "Henry can show you to the sitting room." She picked up her crate and carried it back inside. She set the preserves on the counter. Stood there for a moment with both hands flat on the wood, the way she had the night before, the same posture, the same steadying gesture. Her heart was going faster than she wanted it to, and her face felt hot, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth twice slowly, and reminded herself of something her mother had told her when she was 11 years old and had come home crying because of what the other girls at church had said. "You don't have to fight everyone who throws a stone at you, Maggie. Just don't let them see you bleed." She pulled out the beef. She began to cook. Caleb Foster appeared in the kitchen doorway 40 minutes later, with a look on his face like a man who had witnessed something he wasn't sure how to process. "Miss Ellis?" "Caleb." "You know what she meant," he said. "What Mrs. Sloane said." "I know exactly what she meant," Margaret said without looking up from the stew. "And you just—" He stopped. "Invited her to supper." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" She looked at him. Then this young man who had mocked her on her first day, and had not done so since who was standing in her kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and genuine confusion on his face. "Because there are 2 ways to answer an insult," she said. "One of them leaves you looking small. The other one leaves you looking like you didn't even notice." She turned back to the stew. "I'd rather be the second." Caleb was quiet for another moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said and left. She heard him outside a few minutes later talking to the other hands. She couldn't make out the words, but she heard the tone, the particular low, deliberate tone of a man passing on something he thought mattered. Supper that night was the most charged meal Margaret had produced at the Whitaker Ranch. Not because the food was exceptional, though it was the beef stew, deep and rich, the cornbread perfect, the preserved green beans dressed with butter and vinegar, a dried apple pie she'd put together in the afternoon from the apples she'd found in the cellar, overlooked and slightly shriveled, but still good, still worth something. No, it was charged because of the 7 ranch hands who ate with the particular silence of men paying attention, and because of Gerald Sloane, who ate enthusiastically and said very little, and because of Elaine Sloane, who ate with the controlled, careful manner of a woman who was recalibrating something. And it was charged because of Thomas Whitaker, who sat at the head of the table and watched everything and said almost nothing. When the pie came out, Gerald Sloane actually put his fork down and looked at it. "Tom," he said. "Where did you find this woman?" Thomas said Missouri, in a tone that gave nothing away. "Missouri," Gerald repeated and shook his head. "You always did have luck you didn't deserve." Elaine Sloane set her fork down very quietly. She looked at Margaret, who was standing near the kitchen door. And for the first time that evening, her expression was not calculated. It was something simpler and more honest, and it lasted only a second before she composed herself. It was a look of recognition. The supper ended. The Sloanes stayed late. Gerald drawn into the sitting room with Thomas talking cattle prices and water rights with the focused energy of men who spoke that language fluently, and Elaine Sloane ended up in the kitchen with Margaret in the particular way that things happen in houses, inevitably, without anyone quite deciding it. Margaret was washing dishes. She did not look up when Elaine came in. "You didn't have to invite us," Elaine said. I know. A pause. Most women would have said something. Most women would, Margaret agreed. She set a plate in the rack. I'm not most women. Another silence. Longer. No, Elaine Sloane said slowly. I don't suppose you are. She picked up a dish towel. She began to dry. They worked in silence for several minutes, these two women who had nothing in common except that they were both in different ways performing for an audience that wasn't watching anymore. Then Elaine said quietly, The pie was extraordinary. Margaret said, The apples were a little old. You couldn't tell. Thank you. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. But something had shifted. Some small, careful brick had been moved, and Margaret felt it and did not comment on it, because some things are fragile enough that naming them breaks them. The Sloanes left at 9 o'clock. Thomas walked them to the buckboard. Margaret watched from the kitchen window. She saw him shake Gerald's hand, saw Elaine pause before climbing up and say something to Thomas that Margaret couldn't hear. Thomas's expression didn't change that controlled face, that careful arrangement of features he wore like armor, but he nodded once slowly. He stood there after the buckboard disappeared into the dark. He stood there for a long time. When he came back inside, he stopped in the kitchen doorway. Margaret was wiping down the counter. She didn't look up. Elaine Sloane complimented your cooking, he said. I know, she told me. He was quiet. That woman, he said carefully, doesn't compliment things she doesn't mean. I know that too. Another pause. Miss Ellis. He said it in a way that made her put the cloth down and look at him. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled blankness, not the careful neutrality. Something underneath was pushing against it from the inside. I owe you an apology, he said. Her heart stopped for exactly one beat. She waited. When you arrived, he said, the first day, He stopped, started again. I was not the man I should have been. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the night wind moved through the yard. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, someone laughed at something. The lamp on the counter burned steady and low. Margaret looked at Thomas Whitaker, this man who had shown her a disappointed face on the first day, and had been slowly, unwillingly rearranging himself ever since. And she made another decision, of the kind she'd been making her whole life. The kind that required more courage than she got credit for. I know, she said. I forgive you. Simple. Flat. Not unkind, but not soft either. He blinked, like he'd expected more or less, or something different entirely. Just like that, he said. I don't hold on to things, Margaret said. It costs too much. She picked up the cloth again. Good night, Mr. Whitaker. He stood there for a moment. Then he said, Good night, Miss Ellis, and walked down the hall, and she heard the door of his study open and close. She finished the counter, hung the cloth, turned down the lamp. She walked down the hall to her small room and sat on the edge of the bed. He had apologized. He had looked her in the face and named the thing he had done, and said he was sorry for it, and she had the odd, entirely unexpected sensation of a weight shifting on her chest. Not lifting, not gone, but redistributed, changed, made a little easier to carry. She had forgiven people before. She had made a practice of it, a strategy of it, the way her mother had taught her. But this felt different. This was not forgiveness as self-preservation. This was forgiveness that had cost her something too, because forgiving Thomas Whitaker meant she couldn't quite keep him at arm's length anymore, couldn't quite maintain the clean professional distance she'd built for herself as protection. She had let him mean something. That was the thing she hadn't been ready for. She sat with it for a while in the dark in her room, with the unpacked suitcase against the wall. Then she lay down. Then eventually she slept. The next week hit the ranch like a hammer. It was the end of summer, and the cattle needed moving before the high pastures went dry, which meant 12 to 15-hour days for every man on the property, which meant Margaret feeding not just 7 hands, but sometimes 12, sometimes more, as neighboring ranchers lent workers and received them back. The kitchen became an operation she ran with the precision of someone who had always suspected she was capable of exactly this, and had simply never been given the circumstances to prove it. She tripled the bread baking. She started breakfast at 3:30 in the morning and had food ready for the last man by 9 at night. She managed the cold cellar with a running inventory she updated every single day. She found a young woman from a neighboring family, a 15-year-old girl named Clara, who had been hired to help with laundry, and quietly recruited her to the kitchen during the busy hours, teaching her as she went moving through the lessons with the efficient gentleness of someone who had learned by watching what careless teaching cost a person. Clara, who had expected to spend the summer hauling wet sheets, found herself learning to make gravy. "How do you know when it's thick enough?" she asked. "Coat the back of your spoon," Margaret told her. "Run your finger through it. If the line stays clean, it's ready." Clara tried it, pulled her finger through the gravy, looked at the clean line. "Oh," she said, like something had just opened up for her. Once you know that, Margaret said, you'll never make thin gravy again. It was the kind of teaching that went into a person and stayed. On the fourth day of the cattle drive preparation, Henry Dawson came to her with a problem she hadn't been expecting. "The Henderson's boy quit," he said. "The one cooking for the trail crew. I heard. Thomas is going to ask you if you can send food out to the crew at midday." "How far?" 4 miles, maybe 5, depending on where they move the herd. She did the calculation, the time, the heat, the transportation, what would hold and what wouldn't. "Cornbread travels. Stew in a sealed pot. Cold salt pork if I start it tonight." She looked at Henry. "I'll need the small wagon and someone who knows the route." Henry nodded. "Caleb can drive you." "Then tell Thomas yes." Henry paused. "Thomas was going to come ask you himself." "Tell him anyway." Henry almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She found out later that Henry had in fact told Thomas, and that Thomas had stood in the yard for a long moment before saying quietly to no one in particular, she already had the answer. Which was not the same as saying thank you. But it was close. The first midday delivery, Margaret loaded the wagon with Caleb's begrudging help. He was better than he'd been, but still not what you'd call enthusiastic before 9 in the morning, and they drove out across the rolling grass toward the sound of cattle in the distance. The trail crew saw the wagon coming, and something happened among them that Margaret would remember for a long time. It was the particular animal recognition of hungry people who have been working hard and have just realized that food is coming to them, and they don't have to go anywhere to get it. Men straightened up. Hats came off. Someone said something that made 2 others laugh. She set up the food on the open tailgate of the wagon. She did not make a production of it. She simply put the food out and stood back, and the men came and ate. The trail foreman, a leathery, taciturn man named Reeves, who Margaret had met only once before, and who had said approximately 6 words to her in that encounter, came last. He took his plate, ate, standing up, and then looked at Margaret with the sort of expression that suggested assessment was happening behind his eyes. "You do this every day," he said, "long as the drive lasts." He chewed, swallowed. "Thomas Whitaker's a lucky man," he said. Not flirtatious, not calculated. Just a direct statement from a man who had spent 40 years in trail country and knew what mattered. Margaret said, "He's a hard worker. The ranch is lucky to have good men." Reeves looked at her for one more moment. Then he handed his plate back and walked away. Caleb, who had been listening, said nothing. He simply came and stood beside her and began loading empty pots back into the wagon, which was more than she'd asked of him, and which told her, more than any apology, could have exactly where they stood now. They drove back mostly in silence, the afternoon sun beating down on the flat gold grass. About halfway back, Caleb said, "Miss Ellis." "Caleb, how come you didn't tell that man what you actually thought?" She glanced at him. "Which man?" "Reeves. He was complimenting you. You turned it around to Thomas." Margaret looked at the road ahead. "Because I'm not trying to be noticed," she said. "I'm trying to do the work." Caleb thought about that. "What if doing the work means you never get the credit?" he said. She had a dozen answers to that. She had been giving herself that speech her entire life, every version of it. The philosophical version, the practical version, the version that sounded like strength, and the version that in the dark, at 3 a.m, sounded more like surrender. What she said was, "The work stays, whether anyone notices or not." Caleb nodded slowly. Then, after a moment, "That don't seem fair." "No," Margaret said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't bitterness exactly, but was close enough to its neighbor. "It doesn't." They got back to the ranch as the late afternoon light went copper across the yard. Thomas was there. He was coming from the direction of the cattle pen's, hat in hand, running his hand through his hair in the gesture she was coming to recognize as his version of exhaustion. The thing he did when the control slipped just slightly and something real came through. He saw the wagon. He saw Margaret climb down. He crossed the yard. "How'd it go?" he said. "Fine," she said. "They ate everything." He nodded. A pause. His eyes were doing that thing where he was looking at her with more attention than the conversation required, the particular quality of regard that she had started to feel on her skin, the way you feel weather coming. "The men are saying you drive that wagon like you've been doing it for years," he said. "I drove supply wagons in Missouri. For the boarding house when the regular man was sick." "Of course you did," he said, and it came out softer than he seemed to intend, and he looked away for a moment toward the cattle pens, toward somewhere that was not her face. "Thomas?" she said. He looked back. She almost never used his first name. He went very still. "I know what you're doing," she said quietly. "The noticing. The small things you say that are close to something without quite being it." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking for anything from you. I want you to know that. But I want you to know that I see it too." He stood there. The yard was quiet around them. The late sun was warm on her back. He opened his mouth, closed it, closed. Then, "I don't know what I'm doing," he said, and it sounded like the truest thing he'd said to her yet, raw a little cornered a man who prided himself on knowing exactly where he stood, suddenly standing somewhere he didn't recognize. Margaret looked at him for a moment. "That's all right," she said. "Neither do I." She picked up the empty pot from the wagon and carried it inside. She did not look back, but she was smiling just barely by the time she reached the kitchen. And that night, for the first time since she'd arrived at the Whitaker Ranch, she opened her suitcase. She didn't unpack it. Not yet. But she opened it and ran her hands over the folded things inside and let herself feel the small, complicated, terrifying beginning of something she hadn't dared name yet. And outside, the Montana night came down enormous and full of stars, and the ranch settled into its sounds, and somewhere across the yard she was nearly certain she could hear Thomas Whitaker pacing. She opened the suitcase, but she did not unpack it. That was the line she held for 3 more days. The small private negotiation between hope and caution that had governed most of Margaret's adult life. The suitcase sat open against the wall of her room, like a question she wasn't ready to answer, and every morning she dressed and went to the kitchen and fed 9 men and drove 4 miles out to feed 12 more, and came back and did it all again. And every night she sat on the edge of her bed and looked at that open suitcase and thought, not yet. Not quite yet. Thomas Whitaker, for his part, was doing what Margaret was coming to understand was his particular method of managing things that unsettled him. He worked harder. He was up before her now, which she only knew because the coffee was already made when she came in at 4:30, and the back door had that specific quality of recently closed that a door gets when someone has just gone through it. He was always already outside. Always already at the barn, or the pens, or the fence line, moving through the ranch with the focused energy of a man outrunning something he couldn't name. She understood that too. The morning it changed was a Tuesday, 8 days after the cattle drive preparation had begun, when Margaret was in the kitchen at 5:15, making gravy from the drippings of the previous night's roast, and the back door opened, and it wasn't Thomas. It was Caleb, and his face was wrong. She knew immediately before he said a word that something had happened. His hat was in his hand, and he was turning it by the brim, the nervous gesture she'd come to associate with him when he was managing something large. And there was a particular tightness around his eyes that meant he'd been awake for a while with information he didn't know how to carry. "Caleb," she said. She. "Miss Ellis." He stopped, started again. "There's a man here. Came in last night late after you'd gone to bed. Thomas put him in the bunkhouse. His name's Harlan Cole." She set the spoon down. "Who is he?" Caleb's jaw worked. "He's the man who owns the debt on 3 of the 4 water wells on this property," he said. "He's been holding that debt for 2 years. Thomas has been making payments." He paused. "He says Thomas missed one." The kitchen went very quiet. "Did he?" Margaret said. "I don't know. Henry doesn't know either. But Cole's got papers." Caleb's voice dropped. "Miss Ellis, if that debt gets called in, Thomas loses access to the East Wells. Without the East Wells, he can't water the cattle through a dry fall. He'd have to sell half the herd at summer prices." He stopped. "It'd break the ranch." Margaret stood very still. "Where's Thomas now?" "In the study with Cole. Has been for 20 minutes. She picked up the gravy spoon, set it back down, looked at the stove at the kitchen she had spent 4 weeks rebuilding from nothing, at the labels on the pantry shelves in her own handwriting, at the small cloth pouch of herbs from Missouri still hanging on a nail by the window. "Keep the gravy from sticking," she said, and handed Caleb the spoon. He stared at her. "What?" "Stir it every couple of minutes. Don't let it sit." She was already untying her apron. "I'll be back." "Miss Ellis, you can't just—" But she was already through the door. She knocked on the study door once hard and opened it without waiting. Thomas was behind the desk. Across from him sat a man she had never seen, heavy-set 50s, with the particular self-satisfaction of someone who had spent years holding power over people and had grown comfortable in the posture. He had papers spread on the desk between them. He looked up at Margaret's entrance with the mild surprise of a man who expected to be interrupted by something smaller. Thomas said, "Margaret." "I'm sorry to interrupt." She said, "Not sorry at all. Mr. Cole, is it?" Harlan Cole leaned back in his chair. "That's right, ma'am." "I'm Margaret Ellis. I manage the household accounts for this ranch." She came to the desk and looked at the papers. "May I?" A beat of silence. Thomas was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something between alarm and something else. Something that might have been relief wearing a very thin disguise. Cole waved a hand. "Be my guest." She picked up the top document. She read it carefully. Cole watched her with the faint amusement of a man who didn't expect to be challenged by a woman holding a piece of paper. She set it down. "This records a payment of $53 due on the 14th of August, she said. "What date is it today, Mr. Cole?" Cole blinked. "August 18th. "And you're saying the payment was missed?" "4 days past due, ma'am, per the terms of the agreement that constitutes—" "I know what it constitutes," Margaret said pleasantly. "I'm curious about the delivery. Were you here on the 14th to collect—" A pause. Fractional. "The payment was to be delivered to my office in Millhaven." "That's 40 miles, Margaret said. "It is. And you've ridden 40 miles on a Tuesday to call in a debt that's 4 days late during cattle drive season, when every ranch within 100 miles is running short-handed." She tilted her head. "That seems like a great deal of trouble for 4 days, Mr. Cole." The faint amusement had left Cole's face. Thomas was completely still behind the desk. "The terms of the agreement," Cole started, "are written right there," Margaret said, pointing at the paper. "And I read them. The terms say payment is due by the 14th of each month. They don't say anything about a grace period, you're right, but they also require written notice of default to be delivered to the debtor's address before any acceleration of debt can be pursued." She picked up the document again and turned it to face him. "Where's the written notice, Mr. Cole?" Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Harlan Cole stared at her. Thomas Whitaker was staring at her. The lamp on the desk burned steady and low, and the room held its breath. Cole began. You rode 40 miles without sending written notice first. Margaret said, her voice still perfectly even. Which means you cannot legally call this debt today. You can send notice. Thomas will have 10 days to respond once notice is received. The payment can be made by post within that window. She set the paper down. The nearest post office is in Millhaven, which is convenient, since that's where you'll be riding back to. Cole's face had gone through several colors during this speech. He looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at him with the expression of a man who had just watched something happen that he was still processing. Cole picked up his papers, slowly, with the careful dignity of a man reassembling himself after a fall. "I'll send the notice," he said. "We look forward to receiving it," Margaret said. Cole stood, picked up his hat, and walked out of the study without another word. The room was silent for a very long time. Then Thomas said, "Where did you learn contract law?" Margaret sat down in the chair Cole had vacated. "The boarding house in Missouri. The owner had a dispute with a creditor when I'd been there about 3 years. I helped her read through the documents. I paid attention." She paused. "I always pay attention." Thomas was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. It was something older and more complicated, the look of a man confronting the full dimensions of something he had badly underestimated. "He was going to call that debt," Thomas said. "I know. Without the East Wells. I know." He stood up from behind the desk. He walked to the window, not because there was anything to see, but because he needed to move, needed to do something with the energy of what had just happened. "He's not going to let this go," Thomas said quietly. "Cole, this isn't about 4 days." "No," Margaret agreed. "It isn't. He knew about the cattle drive. He knew you were short-handed and distracted. This was timed." She paused. "Someone told him." Thomas turned. "What? A man doesn't ride 40 miles for a 4-day late payment on a whim," Margaret said. "He came because he expected to win. Someone gave him information about your situation and told him now was the moment." Thomas's face changed. Not the weather change she was used to. This was different. This was the face of a man who has just looked down and seen something beneath the ground he thought was solid. "Gerald Sloan," he said, very quietly. Margaret said nothing. She did not know and would not claim to. But Thomas was nodding slowly, the way people nod when a thing they didn't want to be true arranges itself into the shape of the truth anyway. "Gerald's been after the East pasture for 2 years," he said. "If I had to sell at summer prices distressed, he'd be the first buyer." "That's not evidence," Margaret said carefully. "No." Thomas's jaw was tight. "No, it's not." He stood there. The silence in the room had a different texture now, not the careful silence of two people navigating each other, but the grim, focused silence of two people who have just identified a shared problem. "The payment," Margaret said. "Can it be made?" "Yes." He said it immediately. "It's in the account. It should have been sent last week. I lost track." "The drive," she said. "Yes. Then send it today. Don't wait for the written notice. Pay it now and make sure Cole gets a receipt." She paused. "It removes his grounds and it puts the record clearly on your side." Thomas looked at her. "I'll ride to Millhaven this afternoon," he said. "I know." He picked up his hat from the hook near the door. He stopped. "Margaret." She looked at him. He stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, and she could see him trying to locate words for something that wasn't fitting neatly into language. "Thank you," he said finally. Simple, unadorned. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just make sure that receipt is witnessed." He almost smiled. Almost. He went out. She sat in the study for a moment after he left in the chair that still held the shape of Harlan Cole's confidence, and she breathed in and breathed out and let herself feel the weight of what had just happened. Not the legal maneuvering, not the victory, but the thing underneath it. Thomas Whitaker had looked at her. Really looked at her from behind those careful eyes, and for the first time she had seen no trace of the expression from the stagecoach. Not even the ghost of it. Something had been replaced. She wasn't sure yet with what. She went back to the kitchen. Caleb was standing at the stove with a deeply concentrated expression stirring gravy, like it was a matter of survival. He looked up when she came in. "Well," he said. "The gravy looks good," she said. "Miss Ellis." She tied her apron back on. "Thomas is writing to Millhaven. The debt's being paid today." Caleb stared at her. "How?" She took the spoon from him. "The man didn't send written notice before coming to call the debt. He had no legal standing." A pause. "You knew that," Caleb said. "I read it in the document. In 5 minutes. I read fast." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Ma'am, I think you might be the most dangerous woman I've ever met." She looked at him. He was grinning, and it was the grin of a young man who had fully, irrevocably revised his first impression of someone and was not sorry about it. "Dangerous," she repeated. "In the best way possible," he said. She turned back to the stove. "Go see if Henry needs help with the east fence," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went still grinning. Thomas got back from Millhaven at dusk, tired and dusty, and with a witnessed receipt in his breast pocket, and something in his face that looked for the first time since Margaret had arrived, like a man who had slept not literally, but in the way that matters the internal settling of something that had been braced for impact and could now briefly stand down. He came to the kitchen. Margaret was finishing the supper dishes. Clara had gone home an hour ago. The house was quiet. He sat down at the small table by the window, the same chair he'd taken that first early morning, the one that was becoming, without either of them deciding it, his chair, and she poured him coffee without asking, and set it in front of him, and went back to the dishes. "Done," she said. "Done," he said. Cole received the payment at 3 o'clock. The bank manager witnessed the receipt. "Good." She heard him drink the coffee, heard him set the cup down. "I spoke to Gerald," he said. She stopped washing. "I didn't accuse him," Thomas said. "I didn't have grounds. But I told him the debt had been settled and that the east wells were in good order." A pause. "He wasn't surprised." "No," Margaret said. He was careful not to be surprised, which is its own kind of answer. She started washing again. "What will you do?" she asked. "Watch," Thomas said. "And be more careful." Another pause. "I've been running this ranch like a man with nothing to lose. I keep my head down and work and pay my debts and assume that's enough." He was quiet. "It isn't enough. There are people who interpret that as inattention." "It's a different kind of intelligence," Margaret said. "Managing threats." "It's not my strength," he said. She turned around. He was looking at the table, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands, the gesture of a man who was being honest in a way that cost him something. "It could be," she said, "or you could make sure you have someone around who compensates." He looked up. The space between them felt suddenly different, charged with something she hadn't entirely expected, something that was not just professional gratitude, and not yet the thing she was afraid to name, but was standing squarely between the two. "Is that an offer?" he said. She held his gaze. "I'm already here," she said. "I'm just pointing out that you might want to notice that." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I notice." Low, simple. The words of a man who was choosing them carefully. She turned back to the dishes. Her hands were not entirely steady, and she was glad her back was to him. "Supper's on the stove," she said. "You should eat." She heard him get up, heard him go to the stove, heard the sound of a plate being filled. He did not leave the kitchen. He stayed at the table, and she finished the dishes while he ate, and neither of them spoke, and the silence was the kind that comes after something has been established, not resolved, not decided, but placed on the table between two people where they can both see it. The storm came 2 weeks later, without much warning. Montana weather in September was like that. It built fast out of the north with the particular bad temper of a season that wasn't interested in gradual transitions. It had been warm for 3 days, and then, on the 4th day, the temperature dropped 15 degrees between noon and 3 o'clock, and the sky went the color of an old bruise, and Henry Dawson came to the kitchen with his hat in his hands, and his face set in the way it got when he was delivering news he'd rather not. "Storm coming," he said. "Bad one. Could blow for 2 days." "How many people are still out?" Margaret asked. "Trail crew came in this morning, but we've got 3 neighboring families who are moving cattle and we're going to overnight at the Henderson place. Henderson's roof blew off in July, and they never fixed it right." He paused. "Thomas is going to ride out and bring them in." "How many people total?" Henry did the count in his head. "Maybe 14, 15. Some children." Margaret looked around the kitchen. Did her own count of the food, the space, the resources she had on hand? "Tell Thomas he doesn't need to ride out," she said. "Send Caleb with the wagon. We can fit people in the wagon. And tell him when they get here I'll be ready." Henry stared at her. "You'll be ready," she said. "Go." He went. She started moving. What happened over the next 4 hours was the truest expression of who Margaret Ellis was. Not the careful, controlled person she presented to the world. Not the woman who measured every movement to take up the least possible space. But the person she was when circumstances required her to fully exist. She took inventory in under 10 minutes. She knew the kitchen knew it, the way you know a place you've studied and tended and rebuilt from nothing. She knew what she had and what it could become and how much time each thing required. She sent Clara, who had arrived that morning, to the cold cellar with a list. She started the 2 largest pots she owned, filled them with water, put them on to boil. She pulled the dried beans she'd been saving and started them soaking, and calculated they'd be ready in time if everything moved right. The first wagon arrived an hour after Henry rode out. The Henderson family, mother, father, 3 children, the eldest, maybe 12, came in through the back door with the particular subdued energy of people who had been cold and frightened and were working hard not to show it in front of the children. Margaret met them at the door. "Come in," she said. "There's warmth in the kitchen. I need the children right here." She pointed to the corner near the stove, where it's warmest. "Ma'am, there's a coat hanging on that hook. Please take it. Henry will show your husband where the men can wait out of the wind." She said it all in one breath, calm and clear, and the Henderson family obeyed with the instinctive compliance of people who have just encountered someone who knows what she's doing. The second wagon came 20 minutes later. 2 families this time, the Parkers and the young Newmans, who had only been married a year and whose faces had the particular combination of bravery and barely suppressed terror that belongs to young people encountering their first real emergency. Margaret organized them with the same quiet efficiency. Blankets from the cedar chest in the hall, she had found them her second week and had noted them filed away. You never know. Hot coffee within 10 minutes. Children assessed too were shivering in the real way, not the dramatic way, and she moved them closer to the stove and had Clara bring dry socks from the basket of mending she'd accumulated. By the time Thomas came in from securing the animals, the house held 15 additional people. He stopped in the hallway. He stood there. The house that had been silent for 3 years. The house that had that particular quality of stopped, of held breath, of a clock no one had wound was full of sound. Children's voices, adult conversation, the scrape of chairs, the sound of the stove working hard, and the smell of beans and broth and cornbread moving through every room. Margaret was in the middle of it. Not performing, not managing, just moving through the work. The way she always moved through work, steady and focused, and entirely herself. She looked up and saw Thomas in the hall. She picked up a cup, filled it from the pot, and brought it to him. He took it. He looked at her over the rim. "When did you have time to do all this?" he said. "I started when Henry told me they were coming." He shook his head slowly. "Thomas." It was Clara appearing from the direction of the back room. "The Newman baby, Ruth brought her baby. She's been crying for an hour. I think she's hungry, and Ruth doesn't have—" "I'll handle it," Margaret said immediately. She went. She found Ruth Newman in the back room, a girl barely 20 with dark circles under her eyes and a baby on her hip who was past the crying stage and into the exhausted hitching breath stage that comes after, and Ruth herself was on the edge of the same place. Margaret sat down beside her. She did not offer solutions first. She offered presence. "How old?" she asked, nodding at the baby. 7 months, Ruth said. Her voice was thin. "She's a good size," Margaret said. "Strong lungs." A pause. "What does she need?" Ruth's face crumpled. "I don't know. She won't settle. She's been like this since the storm started. I think she can feel it, the pressure maybe. My mother used to say babies feel storms." "Your mother was right," Margaret said. She held out her hands. "May I?" Ruth hesitated, handed the baby over. Margaret had held very few babies in her life. But there is a knowledge that lives in the body and not the mind, and she shifted the baby against her chest and began to move, not rocking, but a slow particular walk. A rhythm that had no name but seemed to come from somewhere instinctive, and the baby, startled at first, went still, and then, after a long moment, made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite contentment, but was moving in the right direction, and Ruth Newman put both hands over her face and cried with the absolute relief of a young mother who has been carrying fear for 3 hours and has finally been allowed to put it down. Margaret walked the baby slowly around the room, while Ruth cried herself out, and she said nothing because there was nothing to say, because some things do not require commentary. Thomas was in the doorway. He had followed her down the hall, she realized. She didn't know how long he'd been standing there. He was watching her walk his daughter, no, the Newman baby, not his. And his face had gone somewhere entirely private, somewhere she did not have the right to follow without permission. And she looked at him and gave the smallest nod. "I have this. Go." He nodded back. He went. But he went slowly. She found out later from Henry that Thomas Whitaker stood in the hallway outside that room for another full minute before he moved. That he stood there with his coffee and his hat in his hand, and his eyes on the woman who had walked into his broken house 6 weeks ago with a battered suitcase, and had, without announcement, without ceremony, without asking for a single thing in return, begun to fill it back up. Henry told her this 3 days later. Matter-of-factly, the way Henry told things like information that needed to reach the right person, and he was simply the vehicle. Margaret was at the stove when he said it. She did not respond for a long moment. Then she said, "How long has it been since this house felt like a home?" "Henry." Henry was quiet for a while. "Since Eleanor died," he said. Eleanor Thomas's wife. The name she had heard only once before, indirectly, never directly. Eleanor. "He never talks about her," Margaret said. Not a question. "No, ma'am." "Does he need to?" Henry thought about it. "I think," he said slowly, "that he's been waiting for permission to stop being only the man who lost her." He paused. "I don't think anyone's given him that yet. The night of the storm, after all, 15 guests had been settled, some in the sitting room, some in the spare bedroom, the children on pallets near the stove that Margaret had constructed from spare blankets and old quilts after the food had been eaten, and the lamps turned low, and the house gone quiet, with the particular deep quiet of exhausted people at rest. Margaret sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold and let herself be still. The storm was loud outside. Wind against the windows, rain hitting the roof in waves. Inside warm. Inside full. Inside alive in the way that house had not been alive in 3 years. Thomas came in at midnight. She heard his boots and looked up. He sat down at the table. They looked at each other in the lamplight. "Gerald Sloane was at the south fence this afternoon," he said, "before the storm hit, looking at the east pasture." She set her cup down. "And he wasn't just looking," Thomas said. "He had a man with him, a man I recognized. Works for the county land office." His eyes were steady on her face. "Gerald's not trying to buy the land distressed anymore. He's trying to claim it." The words landed in the quiet room like a stone in still water. "On what grounds?" Margaret said. Thomas reached into his breast pocket and laid a paper on the table between them. She picked it up. She read it. She set it back down. Her voice, when she found it, was very careful. "He's claiming the northeast boundary was never properly filed," she said. "Yes. And if the boundary isn't filed, the east pasture and both wells could be reclassified as open range." Thomas's jaw was tight. "Which Gerald Sloan can then claim prior use of because his cattle have grazed there during spring flooding for the last 3 years when my fences were down." "Do you have the original survey documents?" "I have what I can find. I don't know if it's everything." "Where would the rest be?" "County Records Office, Millhaven." Margaret looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the storm was loud and relentless and indifferent to the thing happening at this kitchen table. This reckoning, this convergence of everything that had been building since Harlan Cole walked out of this house with his papers and his wounded pride and his 40-mile ride back to a man who had sent him. "We need those records," she said. "I know." "As soon as the storm breaks." "I know." He paused. "Margaret." The way he said her name had changed over 6 weeks. She heard it, could not have explained it to anyone else, but she heard it. "If Gerald's filed this, if he's already put it in motion, then we fight it," she said. Flat, clear, no cushion. He looked at her. "We," he said, and she realized a beat too late what she had said, and how she had said it, the pronoun she had chosen, the side of the table she had placed herself on without being asked and without asking permission. She lifted her chin. "Yes," she said. "We." Thomas Whitaker looked at the woman across the table from him. The woman with flour on her sleeve and tea going cold in front of her, who had that day organized 15 displaced people in his house and walked a stranger's baby to sleep, and kept her head when Harlan Cole tried to take his wells, and was currently looking at him like she intended to be there for whatever came next. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. The lamp burned low between them. The storm raged outside, and Margaret Ellis, who had spent her whole life being the woman people tolerated, felt the warm weight of a hand choosing her. Not her usefulness, not her cooking, not her competence with contracts and kitchen ledgers, just her sitting at this table, on this side of whatever was coming. She did not move her hand. She let herself be chosen, and the storm kept going loud and uncompromising, the way real things always are. And inside the Whitaker Ranch, the house held all its people warm, fed, sheltered. And at the kitchen table, 2 people sat with their hands together, and the beginning of something that had no name yet, but was taking up real space in the world, the way real things do. The storm broke on the 3rd day. It left behind the particular silence that follows. Something violent, a held-breath quiet. The world rearranged by force, and not yet sure what it was now. The ranch hands moved through the yard assessing damage, and the neighboring families packed their borrowed blankets and accepted Margaret's cornbread wrapped in cloth for the road, and said their goodbyes with the particular warmth of people who have shared a difficult thing and come through it together. Ruth Newman was the last to leave. She stood at the kitchen door with the baby on her hip, the baby who had slept through the 2nd and 3rd nights of the storm without a sound. And she looked at Margaret with an expression that was trying to be casual and not quite managing it. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't have to," Margaret said. She's never settled like that for a stranger before. Ruth looked down at the baby, then back up. "My mother says some people just have it. I don't know what to call it. The knowing." Margaret looked at the baby, who was regarding her with the calm, evaluating gaze of a creature that has already decided what it thinks. "Take care of yourself," Margaret said. "Both of you." Ruth nodded. She started to turn, then she stopped. "That man," she said. "Thomas Whitaker. He was standing in the hall when you were walking Sarah. Did you know that?" "I knew," Margaret said. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "Good," she said, and left. Margaret stood at the kitchen door and watched the last wagon roll out of the yard, and felt the ranch settle back into itself, but differently, like a room after furniture has been rearranged the same dimensions, but the weight distributed in a new way. Thomas was already gone. He'd ridden out at first light before she was up, which she knew only because Henry told her, and because there was fresh coffee made, and a note on the kitchen table written in Thomas's particular angular hand, Millhaven. Back by dark. Don't wait supper. She waited supper. She didn't examine why. Henry came in at noon and sat at the small table and accepted coffee, and did not pretend he wasn't there to talk. "How bad is it?" she asked before he said anything. Henry wrapped both hands around his cup. "The boundary claim is real. Gerald filed it with the county office 3 weeks ago. Thomas didn't know because the notice went to a box in Millhaven he checks maybe once a month." Margaret set her cup down. 3 weeks, she said, while we were running the cattle drive, while Cole was here about the wells. Henry's voice was careful. "Gerald has been moving on 2 fronts at once." She absorbed that. "The filing, is it legitimate? That's what Thomas is trying to find out. If the original survey is on record and the boundary is properly marked, Gerald's claim falls apart. But if there's any gap in the paperwork..." Henry stopped. "Thomas's father did the original filing in 1869, 15 years ago. Some of those records are not what you'd call tidy." "What does Thomas need?" "The original survey map, the 1869 deed filing, and ideally a witness, someone who was present at the original boundary marking." Henry paused. "There was one man, old fella named Archer, who worked for Thomas's father. Lives about 12 miles east if he's still living." "Has anyone asked him?" "Nobody's thought to until about 4 hours ago." Margaret looked at Henry steadily. "I'll go," she said. Henry blinked. "Miss Ellis?" "Does Thomas know about Archer?" "I told him this morning before he left." "Then Thomas is in Millhaven looking for paper and nobody's gone to find the man who was actually there." She was already untying her apron. "That's a gap. I'll fill it." "It's 12 miles. "I know how far 12 miles is, Henry." He looked at her for a long moment with those careful eyes of his that had seen a great deal and were now in the process of rearranging themselves around something new. "Caleb can drive you," he said. "Tell him to hitch the wagon." She was out the door in 10 minutes. Caleb said nothing for the first 3 miles, which was how she knew he understood the gravity of what was happening. Caleb's silence was always proportional to the seriousness of a situation. The more he wasn't talking, the worse things were. At mile 4 he said, "You know, if this land claim goes through, Thomas loses more than the wells." "I know. The east pasture is 1/3 of his grazing land. Without it..." He shook his head. "He'd have to reduce the herd, take on debt to survive the winter, and with Cole already holding paper on the wells..." Another headshake. "It's like they planned it to happen all at once." "They did," Margaret said. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "Gerald Sloane has sat at Thomas's table," he said, "eaten his food, drunk his whiskey." "Yes. And he's been doing this the whole time. Longer than we know, probably." Caleb was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had the low, controlled anger of a young man who has just fully understood something. "What are we going to do?" he said. And Margaret noticed the pronoun, the same one she had used the night before with Thomas. "We." The ranch pulling together, drawing its edges inward, becoming a single thing with a single purpose. "We're going to find Archer," she said. "And then we're going to deal with Gerald Sloane in a way he doesn't recover from." Caleb looked at her sideways. "You already know how," he said, not a question. "I'm working on it," she said. "Drive." James Archer was 71 years old and lived alone in a small house that listed slightly to the left, as though it had been leaning into a west wind for decades and had simply stayed that way. He answered the door with a rifle in one hand and a look of profound suspicion that softened incrementally as he took in Caleb and then Margaret and made his assessment. "You're from Whitaker's," he said. "Yes, sir," Margaret said. "I'm Margaret Ellis. I manage the household there." Archer looked her up and down with the frank appraisal of a very old man who has decided he's earned the right to be direct. "You the mail-order bride." I'm the woman Thomas Whitaker wrote to from Missouri, she said. That's close enough. Archer made a sound that might have been a laugh. Come in then. His house was the kind of ordered chaos that belongs to a man who lives alone and has his own system that no one else can read. He moved through it with complete confidence, clearing a chair by the simple method of picking up what was on it and putting it on the floor and waving Margaret toward it. She sat down. You remember the 1869 boundary survey, she said. No preamble. She'd decided on the way that this man would respond better to directness than to working up to it. Archer sat across from her. His eyes were sharp in his old face, the eyes of a man whose body had aged faster than his mind. I was there, he said. Drove the stakes myself. Me and Thomas's father and a county man named Beaumont. Is Beaumont still dead? 10 years. The stakes, Margaret said. Are they still in the ground? Archer looked at her steadily. Somebody told you they might not be. Gerald Sloan filed a boundary dispute 3 weeks ago claiming the northeast corner was never properly surveyed. Archer's face changed. Not surprise. Something harder than surprise. Gerald Sloan, he said. You know him. Knew his father. Archer was quiet for a moment, and the quality of his silence was the kind that carries weight. His father tried the same thing with the Henderson property 20 years ago. Different approach, same end. He looked at his hands. The Sloans have been reaching for land in this valley since before Thomas Whitaker was old enough to ride. Mr. Archer, Margaret leaned forward. Would you come to Millhaven and testify to what you witnessed in 1869, the location of the stakes, the presence of the county surveyor, the proper filing of the boundary? Archer looked at her for a long time. I'm 71 years old, he said. I know. My hip gives me trouble. We have a wagon. Another long silence. Thomas's father was a fair man, Archer said finally. One of the few. He pushed himself up from his chair. Let me get my coat. Margaret stood. She felt something unlock in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but the first breath after holding it a long time. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Archer said, pulling his coat from a hook. Thank me when it's done. They got back to the Whitaker Ranch at 4 o'clock with James Archer in the wagon bed. His bad hip stretched out before him, talking to Caleb about cattle prices in a way that suggested he had not had a real conversation in several months and was making up for lost time. Thomas was already back. He was in the yard when the wagon came in, and he looked at Margaret first, just for a second. The particular searching look she had come to know meant he was assessing whether something had gone wrong, and she shook her head once. Not wrong. He exhaled. Then he saw Archer. He stood very still. Jim, he said. Archer squinted at him from the wagon. You got old. So did you. I had the decency to do it slower. Archer accepted Caleb's help climbing down, waved off any further assistance, and stood in the yard, looking at Thomas with a direct, assessing gaze. Your woman came to find me. Thomas glanced at Margaret. She did not look away. I found the original filing, Thomas said. In the county records. The boundary is on record. A pause. But there's a gap in the map. A corner notation that's unclear. Gerald's using it. I can speak to the corner notation, Archer said. I put the stake in myself. Northeast corner of the upper east pasture 12 feet from the creek bend. It'll still be there. Wood rots, but the iron marker under it doesn't. Something moved across Thomas's face. You remember that, he said. I remember everything, Archer said. That's the only advantage of being old. Everything that happened to you is still there. He paused. The ones who try to rewrite it are always counting on people forgetting. I haven't forgotten. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Henry, get Mr. Archer set up in the spare room. He'll be staying tonight. He looked at Margaret. We need to talk. They went to the study. Thomas closed the door. He had the documents from the county records spread on the desk. She could see them from across the room. The old paper. The official stamps the handwriting from 15 years ago. "Here?" he said and pointed. She came around the desk and stood beside him and looked. The northeast corner notation on the original map read, "Boundary continues northeast to Creek Bend Stake, placed per survey, and then a smudge." An ink smudge over what should have been the precise measurement from a fixed reference point. "That smudge," she said. "Gerald's lawyer is arguing it makes the corner indefinite, that without the precise measurement the boundary can't be established." "But Archer was there." "Eyewitness testimony," Thomas said. "It carries weight. But Gerald's lawyer will argue memory. An old man 15 years ago." He paused. "We need more than Archer." Margaret looked at the map. She looked at it the way she looked at things she was trying to understand quietly with her full attention, letting the object tell her what it knew. "The iron marker," she said. "If it's still there." "It'll be there," she said. "Archer said so. We need to find it and document it before Gerald does." Thomas's jaw was tight. "If Gerald gets out to that corner first and the marker disappears." "Then we go tomorrow," Margaret said. "First light. You, me, Archer, and a witness from town." Thomas looked at her. "The county surveyor," she said. "If we bring the county surveyor to the marker, if he sees it in place and documents it officially, Gerald's claim is finished before it starts." Thomas was very still. "Dan Reeves is the county surveyor," he said. "He's Gerald's cousin." The word landed in the room like a dropped weight. Margaret absorbed it. "Who else?" she said. "There's no other surveyor within 60 miles. She thought fast. "A lawyer, then. Thomas, if we get a lawyer out there tomorrow with Archer, and the lawyer witnesses the marker and signs an affidavit, that's a legal document. That's evidence. It doesn't require a surveyor. The only lawyer in Millhaven is Gerald's lawyer." "Not in Millhaven." Margaret looked at him. "The circuit judge, Judge Harding. He rides this territory every other month. When's he due?" Thomas's expression shifted. 2 weeks, he said slowly. "And in 2 weeks, Gerald's claim goes to a preliminary hearing." Thomas turned toward the desk. "If we can get the affidavit from Archer documented by any officer of the court, even a notary before that hearing." "Is there a notary in Millhaven?" "Eleanor's brother," Thomas said quietly. "Robert. He's been the town notary for 12 years. The name sat between them, Eleanor. That private name, the woman who had been here before Margaret, the silence at the center of this house, and Margaret felt the particular delicacy of the moment, the way some doors are thin and you have to be careful how hard you push. "Would he help?" she said, carefully. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor would have wanted him to," he said. He said it simply, without performance, and it told Margaret more about Thomas Whitaker than anything he had said in 2 months, that he could hold the people he'd lost without being destroyed by them, that somewhere in the last weeks something had shifted in him enough to let him say her name in front of Margaret and not flinch. "Then we go to Robert tomorrow," she said. "Yes," Thomas said. He looked at her. She looked at him. And then he did something she didn't expect. He pulled out the chair at the desk. His chair, the one he sat in alone every night, and he pushed it toward her, and he pulled up the side chair, the one for visitors, the one Harlan Cole had sat in, and he sat in that one instead. He handed her the map. "Tell me what you see," he said, "that I might be missing." She looked at him. He was serious. She sat down in his chair. She picked up the map. She looked at it for a long time. "The smudge," she said. "It's not an accident." Thomas frowned. "What do you mean?" "Look at the rest of the document." She turned it toward him and pointed. "The ink throughout is even, consistent. The hand is careful. A man who writes like this doesn't smudge a critical measurement." She looked at him. "Someone smudged it deliberately, later, after the document was filed." Thomas went very still. "The county records office," he said. "Someone had access to the original document after it was filed and before anyone needed to look at it closely." She set the map down. "Thomas, this was planned far longer ago than 3 weeks." He stood up, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her. "How long?" he said. "Long enough that someone got into the county records office without raising suspicion. long enough to know exactly which document needed altering to make the claim viable. She paused. The Sloanes have been reaching for this land since before you were old enough to ride. That's what Archer said. Thomas turned. His face was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was the face of a man who has understood something fully all at once, and the understanding is colder and larger than he was ready for. Gerald's been planning this since before my father died, he said. Maybe, Margaret said. Or since after, when you were grieving and not looking. She held his gaze. It doesn't matter when it started. What matters is that we have Archer. We have the original filing, and tomorrow we get the affidavit. If the document was deliberately altered, that's not just a property dispute. That's fraud. The word hung in the air. Thomas looked at her with an expression she would remember for a very long time. Fraud, he said. Documented fraud, she said. If we can prove the document was altered, if we can establish when the alteration occurred, and who had access. Gerald Sloane doesn't just lose the land claim. He faces criminal charges. The silence in the room was the kind that comes after the shape of something becomes clear for the first time. Not comfortable, but clarifying the way cold air is clarifying. I need to send a wire tonight, Thomas said. To a lawyer in Helena, not Gerald's lawyer, not anyone in Millhaven. He was already moving. A man I went to school with, Calvin Ridge. He's been practicing law in Helena for 8 years. If I wire him tonight, he can be here by the end of the week. Do it, Margaret said. Thomas paused at the door. Margaret. She looked up. I'm going to ask you something, he said, and I want you to tell me the truth. She waited. If I hadn't written that advertisement, he said slowly, if you'd never come here. He stopped. Who was looking out for this ranch? She understood what he was really asking. It was not about the ranch. Nobody, she said. That's why things get worse slowly until they get worse all at once. You were doing everything alone, and there was no one to see what you were missing. She held his gaze. That's not a criticism, Thomas. That's just a person can't see their own blind spots. That's what they are. He looked at her for a long moment. Mine were significant, he said. Yes, she said. They were. He nodded. Simple, undefended. Not anymore, he said. And he went to send the wire. The next 3 days moved fast, the way days do when something is at stake and everyone knows it. They rode out to the northeast corner at first light the next morning. Thomas, Margaret Archer, Caleb, and Henry. And they found the iron marker exactly where Archer said it would be, 12 feet from the creek bend, driven into the ground 15 years ago by a man who was now dead, but whose work was still there solid and precise. Archer stood over it with his bad hip and his old eyes and pointed at it like it was an old friend. There it is, he said. Thomas crouched down, brushed the dirt from the iron with his hand. He stood up. He looked at Margaret. Robert Vance meets us in Millhaven at 2 o'clock, she said. We bring Archer. We bring photographs if we can get them, and we get the affidavit signed and witnessed today. Photographs, Caleb said suddenly. They all looked at him. Henderson has a camera, he said. His wife uses it. She photographed the whole family last Christmas. The equipment's at their place. He was already thinking, I can ride there and back before noon. Thomas looked at Margaret. She nodded once. Go, Thomas said. Caleb went. He was back at 11:30 with the camera and Henderson's wife herself, a sharp-eyed woman named Dorothy, who had been told only that it was important and had asked no other questions, and saddled up. Dorothy Henderson photographed the iron marker from 4 angles. She photographed Archer standing beside it. She photographed the creek bend as reference. She worked with the efficient certainty of a woman who understood that she was doing something that mattered and was not interested in wasting time. When she was done, she looked at Margaret. Will this help? She said. Enormously, Margaret said. Dorothy nodded, packed her equipment. Gerald Sloane sent his foreman to buy our north pasture last spring, she said, pulling on her gloves. Offered half what it was worth and acted like we should be grateful. She picked up her camera case. I hope you bury him. She rode back the way she came. Caleb stared after her. "I've never heard Mrs. Henderson say more than 10 words in a row," he said. "People surprise you," Margaret said. "Let's move." Robert Vance was a slight, precise man in his early 40s who wore his profession in his posture upright, careful. Someone who had spent years in rooms where the exact placement of words was the difference between outcomes. He had his wife's coloring, dark eyes, strong jaw, and Eleanor's ghost was in his face in a way that made Margaret careful about where she looked when he first shook her hand. "Miss Ellis," he said. "Mr. Vance." He held her hand a moment longer than a normal handshake. "My sister spoke well of you," he said. Then quietly, "She would have liked you." Margaret had no ready answer for that. She said, "Thank you," and meant it entirely, and they went inside. The affidavit took 2 hours to prepare properly. Robert was meticulous, the kind of meticulousness that comes from knowing exactly what opposing lawyers will look for and ensuring there is nothing to find. He questioned Archer thoroughly, not skeptically, but precisely, laying the foundation the way you lay foundations, each question building on the last. Archer held up magnificently. He was sharp and specific and unshakable, and when Robert asked him for the 4th time to confirm the precise location of the northeast stake, Archer said, "Young man, I drove that stake myself, and I could find it blindfolded in a snowstorm. Ask me again if it makes you feel better." Robert looked up from his papers. He almost smiled. "No further questions," he said. When it was done, signed, witnessed, sealed, Robert looked at Thomas across the table. "The alteration," he said. "You believe it was deliberate?" "Yes," Thomas said. "Can you prove it?" "Calvin Ridge is coming from Helena," Margaret said. "He'll need access to the county records. The full file, not just the survey document, but everything associated with the 1869 filing. Access logs if they exist. Any notation of when the file was last pulled." Robert looked at her. "You want to establish when the document was accessed and by whom," he said. "I want to establish that the alteration happened after the filing, which means someone got into the county records and changed an official document. That's not a property dispute anymore." Robert was very still. He looked at Thomas. "If this is what she thinks it is," he said carefully, "Gerald Sloan is looking at more than losing a land claim." "I know," Thomas said. "He has a great deal of standing in this county, friends on the town council. The county assessor was at his daughter's wedding." "I know that too," Thomas said. Robert looked down at the affidavit in his hands. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "I'll make 3 copies. One for Thomas, one for the circuit court, one that I hold personally." He looked up. "And I'll make some inquiries about those county records, quietly." He paused. "Eleanor always said this valley needed someone willing to make things uncomfortable. She was usually the one doing it." A small, sad smile crossed his face. "I've been looking for an excuse." They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon. The affidavit in Thomas's breast pocket, the photographs wrapped carefully in oilcloth in the saddlebag, Archer dozing in the wagon bed with the easy sleep of a man who has done what he came to do. Thomas rode beside the wagon, and Margaret rode beside Thomas, the two of them side by side on the open road, with the September light going golden across the grass. For a long time neither spoke. Then Thomas said, "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd sent you back." Margaret looked at him. "The morning after you arrived," he said, "I thought about it. I nearly—" He stopped. "I had every wrong thought a man could have. About what I expected. About what I deserved." He was looking at the road ahead. "I didn't send you back because I told myself the ranch needed the help. I told myself it was practical." "Wasn't it?" Margaret said. "Yes," he said. "And no." He was quiet for a moment. "I kept your letter, you know. The one you sent when you answered the advertisement. I read it 3 times before I wrote back." She hadn't known that. "Why 3 times?" she said. He glanced at her. "Because after the first time I thought this is a woman who knows herself. After the second time I thought this is the most honest letter I've ever received. After the third time, he paused. After the third time, I thought that if the person who wrote this letter walked into my house, I'd be lucky. And then you walked in, and He stopped again. You looked at me and forgot the letter, she said. Yes, he said, blunt, honest. I am not proud of it. I know. I was wrong. I know that too. He looked at her. You forgave me for it before I'd earned it. I told you, she said. I don't hold things. It costs too much. I've been trying to earn it anyway, he said, since that first night. She was quiet. You have, she said. The wagon rolled on ahead of them. Archer was still asleep. Caleb was pretending not to listen, which she could tell by the very specific angle of his head. Margaret, Thomas said. She looked at him. When this is resolved, he said, when Calvin comes from Helena and we've dealt with Gerald and the boundary is established. He stopped. Tried again. I want to talk about what comes next. Her heart did the thing it had been doing more frequently, the thing she kept refusing to name. All right, she said. Not about the ranch, he said carefully. About us. What we are. He paused. What we could be. She looked at him steadily. I'm already here, Thomas, she said. I know, he said. I'm asking you to stay. The words were simple. They fell into the quiet afternoon without drama, without performance, and they were the most important thing anyone had said to her in a very long time, perhaps in her entire life. Not you're useful, I need you, but stay. I want you to stay. She thought of the suitcase. Still open, not yet unpacked. Ask me again, she said. When it's over, when the land is settled and Gerald Sloane has been dealt with properly. She held his gaze. Ask me when there's no crisis. Ask me when it's just an ordinary day and you still want to. He looked at her. I'll ask you every day until you say yes, he said. She looked away. She looked at the road ahead, at the wide Montana sky, at the grass moving in the long light, and she let herself feel the full weight of this, the terror and the hope and the strange, hard-won steadiness of a woman who has been waiting her whole life for something real. That might be a long time, she said. I've got time, Thomas said. Caleb from the wagon seat made a sound that he tried to disguise as a cough. Thomas looked at him. You're not as subtle as you think, Thomas said. Sorry, sir, Caleb said. Not sorry at all. Margaret smiled. She kept her face forward so no one saw it, but she smiled. They got back to the ranch as the sun was going down, and Henry was waiting in the yard, with news on his face, the kind of news that needed to be delivered fast. Calvin Ridge wired back, he said. He's coming. But there's something else. He looked at Thomas. Gerald Sloane was in town today. He filed an amended claim. Thomas went still. Amended how? Margaret said. Henry looked at her. He's not just claiming the northeast boundary is invalid, Henry said. He's claiming the entire original deed has a procedural defect. That Thomas's father filed it under a territorial law that was superseded before it was processed. He paused. If he's right about that, he's not right, Margaret said. Because if he were right, the defect would have been caught when Montana achieved statehood, and all territorial deeds were reviewed. She looked at Henry. Were they reviewed? 1889, Henry said slowly, when Montana came into the Union. And the Whitaker deed was confirmed at that time, Henry thought. There's a letter, in the deed file. I've seen it. Find that letter tonight, Margaret said. Before anything else, find that letter. Henry was already moving. Thomas was watching her. He amended the claim today, Thomas said quietly. The same day we got the affidavit. She looked at him. Someone told him, she said. The words settled over them like weather. Someone in Millhaven. Someone who had seen them at Robert Vance's office, or heard they were coming, or put together the pieces fast enough to warn Gerald Sloane that his first approach was about to fail, and he needed another one. Robert, Thomas said. Is Robert? No. Margaret said immediately. Not Robert. You're certain? She thought of Robert Vance's face when he said Eleanor always said this valley needed someone willing to make things uncomfortable. She thought of the way he'd held her hand. "Yes," she said. "I'm certain." "Then who?" She didn't know, not yet, but she would find out. She looked at the house, her kitchen, her pantry with its labeled shelves, the table where Thomas had put his hand over hers in the middle of a storm while 15 people slept around them. She looked at it and felt something she hadn't felt about any place since she was a girl in her mother's house in Missouri. She felt ownership, not in the legal sense, not in the document sense, but in the sense that matters more, the sense that says this is mine to protect. "Henry," she said. He turned. "Find the letter, and then find out who was in earshot of Robert Vance's office today. I want names." Henry looked at her for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went. Henry found the letter. It was in the deed file exactly where he'd said it might be tucked behind the original land grant in an envelope that had gone soft with age and handling. The paper inside was brittle at the folds, but the ink was clear. A formal confirmation from the Montana Territorial Review Committee, dated March 14, 1889, affirming the Whitaker deed as valid under the new state's land statutes, signed by 3 committee members and stamped with the territorial seal. He brought it to the study at 9 o'clock that night and laid it on the desk in front of Thomas and Margaret without a word. Thomas picked it up. He read it once fast and set it down. He looked at Margaret. "Gerald knows about this letter," she said. "He has to. He would have researched the deed before filing." She looked at the document. "Which means his amended claim isn't a mistake. It's a bluff." "Why bluff when you could just—" "Because the original plan isn't working," she said. "The Wells claim failed. The boundary claim is about to fail. He's running out of legal ground and he knows it. So he files something complicated and intimidating and hopes Thomas doesn't have the resources to fight it before the hearing." She looked at Thomas. "He's betting you're alone." Thomas was quiet. "He's been betting that for years," he said. She held his gaze. "He's wrong," she said. Thomas looked at her, at this woman who had arrived in his yard 2 months ago with a battered suitcase and a face that had already learned to absorb other people's disappointment, who had reorganized his kitchen and saved his wells and found his witness and ridden 12 miles on a dirt road and was now sitting in his study at 9 o'clock at night reading his grandfather's land documents like they were her own, and he felt something move through him that he had been carefully not naming for weeks. He was done not naming it. "I'm going to wire Calvin tonight," he said, "about the amended claim and the 1889 letter. He needs the full picture." "Tell him about the document alteration too," Margaret said. "The smudge on the survey map. I want him thinking about fraud from the moment he gets off the train." Thomas nodded. "Henry, can you ride to the telegraph office tonight?" Henry was already picking up his hat. "I'll be there and back before midnight." He went. Caleb appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, which suggested he had been very close to it. "I found out who was near Robert Vance's office today," he said. Thomas and Margaret both looked at him. Caleb's jaw was tight. "Dan Reeves," he said. "The county surveyor. Gerald's cousin. He was in the building across the street, the feed store, for over an hour." "He was watching for us," Margaret said. "Had to be. Nobody buys an hour's worth of feed." Caleb's voice was controlled and cold, in the way that young men's voices get when they are furious and have decided to be strategic about it. "He saw us go in, saw Archer, probably put it together fast enough to get to Gerald before we were halfway home." Thomas stood up. "Reeves is the county surveyor," he said. "If Calvin needs an independent survey to document the iron markers—" "He can't use Reeves," Margaret said. "But he doesn't need Reeves. He has Dorothy Henderson's photographs and Archer's affidavit. A judge can look at a photograph." She paused. "Thomas, when does the circuit judge arrive?" 12 days. "Calvin gets here in how long?" 3 days if he leaves tomorrow. Then we have 9 days after Calvin arrives to build the full case." She looked at the 1889 letter on the desk. The bluff about the procedural defect falls apart with this letter. The boundary claim falls apart with the affidavit and the photographs. And if Calvin can establish the survey document was deliberately altered. She stopped. Gerald faces fraud charges, Thomas said. And conspiracy, she said, because he didn't do this alone. Reeves is involved. Whoever altered that document is involved. She looked at Thomas. This is bigger than a land dispute. It's been a coordinated effort to take this ranch for years. The judge needs to see the whole picture. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. You've been thinking about this since the storm, he said. I've been thinking about it since Harlan Cole walked in with his papers, she said. That was the first domino. Once I saw that the rest of it started making sense. Thomas shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in something closer to wonder. Get some sleep, she said. We have 9 days and we need to start early. She stood up. He caught her hand, not the careful tentative gesture from the kitchen table during the storm. This was deliberate. This was a man who had made up his mind. Margaret, she looked at him. I know you said to ask you when it's over, he said. When there's no crisis, when it's just an ordinary day. Thomas, I know, he said. I know. But I need you to know something right now tonight before any of the rest of it gets resolved. He was looking at her steadily the way he looked at things that mattered. Whatever happens with the land, whatever happens with Gerald Sloan, I know what I want. I've known for a while. He paused. I wanted to say it out loud before another day went by where I hadn't. She looked at his hand over hers. She looked at his face, that weathered, careful, honest face that had shown her its worst version on the first day and its truest version over the week since. I know, she said quietly. I know what you want. And, he said. She let the silence hold for one long, deliberate moment. Ask me in 9 days, she said. Ask me when Gerald Sloan is finished. She felt his hand tighten once briefly on hers. Then she went to bed. She lay in the dark with the open suitcase against the wall, and she pressed her hands flat against the blanket and felt her own heartbeat and let herself say privately in the space of her own chest where no one could hear it, yes. The answer is yes. But she wanted to earn it. She wanted to see it through. She wanted the yes to come from a place that wasn't crisis and wasn't need, but was simply the clear, steady choice of a woman who knew her own mind. 9 days. Calvin Ridge arrived on the afternoon of the third day, exactly as Thomas had predicted. A lean man in his late 30s with sharp eyes and a lawyer's economy of expression who shook hands briefly and wanted documents immediately. Margaret had them organized and waiting on the desk. Calvin sat down, looked at the stack, and looked up at her. You put this together, he said. With Thomas and Henry, she said. He looked at the stack again. Thomas said to listen to you. Did he? Said you'd already found 3 things he'd missed, and he'd rather you were running point on this. Calvin picked up the survey map. Walk me through it. She walked him through it. All of it. The timeline of Cole's debt call, the boundary filing the amended procedural claim, the smudge on the survey document, Archer's testimony, Dorothy Henderson's photographs, Dan Reeves at the feed store. Calvin listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You're right that it's fraud, he said. If we can establish the alteration was deliberate, and that Reeves was involved, and if Gerald Sloan coordinated with both Cole and Reeves, we're looking at conspiracy to defraud, tampering with public records, and potentially extortion. He set the map down. That's not a property hearing. That's a criminal matter. Can we get there in 9 days? Thomas said. We can lay the foundation, Calvin said. The land case is winnable now. The fraud case needs more. He looked at Margaret. You said Reeves had access to the county records. Can we establish when the survey document was last pulled from the file? Robert Vance said he'd make inquiries quietly, she said. I'm expecting to hear from him. Get me a meeting with Vance, Calvin said. Tomorrow if possible. "I'll send word tonight," she said. Calvin looked at her. "Thomas was right," he said. "You're running point." She didn't respond to that. She went to write the letter to Robert. The next 7 days were the fastest and most exhausting of Margaret's time at the Whitaker Ranch, and she had not had a slow day since she arrived. Calvin and Robert Vance met the following morning and were in Robert's office for 4 hours. Margaret was not in the room. She had learned long ago that some things move faster when you step back and let people who speak a particular language use it without translating. But she was outside when they emerged, and she read the result in Robert's face before he said a word. "The county records office keeps a log," Robert said. "Every file pulled every date. The surveyor's files are in a separate cabinet that requires a key." He paused. "There are 3 keys. The clerk holds one. The county assessor holds one." He stopped. "And the third," Margaret said. "Dan Reeves," Robert said, "as county surveyor." The air between them held the weight of that. "When was the survey file last pulled?" Calvin said. 14 months ago," Robert said. "Signed out by Dan Reeves. Returned the same day." He looked at Thomas. "The smudge on your survey map was made sometime in the last 14 months. Thomas was very still. "That's when Gerald started planning this," he said. "Right after the dry summer, when my cattle numbers were down, and it looked like I might not make it through the winter." "He thought you'd sell," Margaret said. "He made an offer," Thomas said. "Last October. I turned it down." His jaw was tight. He decided that if I wouldn't sell, he'd take it. Calvin was already writing notes. "We take this to Judge Harding," he said. "The log, the key record, Archer's affidavit, the photographs, the 1889 confirmation letter. We present the property case, and we present the fraud evidence simultaneously." He looked up. "The judge has discretion to refer the criminal matter to the territorial prosecutor. If he does, Reeves and Sloan both face charges independent of the land case." "Will he?" Thomas said. Calvin looked at Robert. Robert looked at Thomas. "Judge Harding's wife," Robert said carefully, "lost her family's homestead to a fraudulent claim in 1878, before she came to Montana." He paused. "He takes this kind of thing personally." The silence that followed had a different quality than any silence Margaret had felt in this house. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of something becoming inevitable. 2 days before the hearing, Gerald Sloan came to the ranch. He did not send word ahead. He simply rode in at mid-morning alone, without his foreman, without lawyers. And that alone told Margaret something. A man who arrives alone to a place he's been trying to take is either very confident or very afraid. And the way Gerald's shoulders sat as he dismounted told her it wasn't confidence. Thomas was at the fence line. Henry went to get him. Margaret was in the kitchen. She stayed there because she wanted to hear. Gerald came to the front door. He knocked. Thomas came around the side of the house. "Gerald," he said. "Tom." Gerald Sloan's voice had lost some of its usual dimension, that particular quality of a man who expects rooms to arrange themselves around him. "We should talk." "I reckon we should have talked before you filed a fraudulent boundary claim against my property," Thomas said. "But here we are." A pause. "The claim was," Gerald started, "was based on a document that your cousin altered," Thomas said. "With a key he signed out himself from the county records 14 months ago." His voice was even, completely even. "Calvin Ridge has the log. Robert Vance has a copy, and Judge Harding will have it in 2 days." Silence. The particular silence of a man whose plan has collapsed and who is recalibrating in real time. Margaret set her dishcloth down. She walked to the front door and opened it. Gerald Sloan looked at her. She looked back at him. He was up close and in the full light of consequence, a smaller man than he'd appeared at that first supper, not in size, but in the way that people shrink when the thing they've been using to make themselves large is taken away. "Miss Ellis," he said. His voice was careful. "Mr. Sloan," she said. She stepped out onto the porch. "You came to make an offer." A beat. "I came to talk," he said. "You came to see if there was a price," she said. for Thomas to drop the evidence and settle quietly. She looked at him steadily. There isn't. Gerald looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at him with the expression of a man who has been made angry enough to arrive at the other side of anger, where things are cold and clear. I built this ranch from nothing, Thomas said. My father built it before me. You've been trying to take it since before he died. He took one step forward. You used my grief. You used the dry season. You used my trust. His voice did not rise. You had a man in my house eating at my table, while his cousin was in the county records altering my documents. Gerald opened his mouth. Don't, Thomas said. Gerald closed it. You have 2 days before the hearing, Thomas said. What you do with them is your business. But understand this, I'm not settling. I'm not negotiating, and I'm not dropping anything. He held Gerald's gaze. You'll answer for this in front of the judge. All of it. Gerald Sloane stood there for a long moment. He looked at the house, at the yard, at the men working near the fence who were no longer pretending not to watch. He looked at Margaret last. She did not look away. You did this, he said. Quiet, not accusatory, almost wondering. Thomas did this, she said. I just helped him see what was already there. Gerald put his hat on. He walked to his horse. He rode out. Nobody spoke for a moment after the sound of hooves faded. Then Caleb, from the fence where he'd been standing with his arms folded and his hat pushed back, said, Well, that's that then. Henry made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Thomas turned and looked at Margaret. She looked back at him. 2 more days, she said. 2 more days, he said. She went inside to start lunch. The hearing before Judge Harding took place on a bright Thursday morning in the Millhaven Courthouse, a small room with hard wooden seats and a territorial flag that had gone slightly faded at the edges, the kind of room where things that mattered to ordinary people were decided without ceremony. Half the county showed up. Margaret had not expected that. She had expected Thomas and Calvin and Robert and Archer and the documents. And she had expected Gerald Sloane and his lawyer, a slick man from Billings named Patterson, who had the particular expression of someone who has already seen the ground shifting and is trying to decide how to land. What she had not expected was the Hendersons, the Newmans. Reeves showing up pale and separately from Gerald, with the look of a man who has spent 2 days being extremely aware that he is facing criminal charges and has not slept. The Parkers who had sheltered in her kitchen during the storm. Old Jim Archer in his best coat driven in by Caleb, and looking like a man who has been waiting for this particular day for a long time. Elaine Sloane was there. She sat in the back apart from Gerald's side of the room. Apart from everyone. She wore a dark dress and her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking at the floor. And when Margaret passed her, Elaine looked up. They looked at each other for one moment. Elaine gave a very small nod. Margaret nodded back. Judge Harding was a compact, gray-haired man in his 60s, with the unhurried authority of someone who has presided over enough proceedings to know that speed and justice are rarely the same thing. He read every document Calvin placed before him. He asked questions that were precise and uncomfortable, and he asked them of everyone equally. Gerald's lawyer Patterson argued the procedural defect with smooth confidence for 20 minutes. Calvin Ridge presented the 1889 confirmation letter in 4 sentences. Patterson's smooth confidence developed a crack. Calvin presented Archer's affidavit. He presented Dorothy Henderson's photographs. He presented the county records log showing Dan Reeves's key access 14 months ago. He presented Robert Vance's notarized statement about the timeline and the evidence. He presented all of it with the methodical patience of a man who has spent his adult life learning that a well-built case does not need drama because the facts provide it. Judge Harding asked Patterson 3 questions about the amended procedural claim. Patterson answered 2 of them. The third one, can you account for the condition of the survey document prior to Reeves's key access? 14 months ago, he could not answer. And the way he could not answer it, the careful lawyerly non-answer he produced, told the room everything. Gerald Sloane sat at the table with the stillness of a man who is watching something he built over years come down in a morning. Then Judge Harding asked Jim Archer to stand and confirm his testimony. Archer stood. He was 71 years old with a bad hip, and he stood straight. He confirmed every detail of the 1869 survey, the location of the stakes, the presence of the county surveyor, the iron marker at the northeast corner, 12 feet from the creek bend. He described the day with the precision of a man who had been carrying the memory carefully for 15 years, keeping it intact against exactly this moment. When he finished, the room was quiet. Judge Harding looked at his papers for a moment. Then he looked up. "The boundary claim filed by Gerald Sloan is dismissed," he said. "The Whitaker deed stands as filed and confirmed. The northeast boundary is established per the 1869 survey as testified." He paused. "Furthermore," he said, and his voice changed, not louder but denser, with the particular weight of a man choosing words that will have consequences. "The evidence presented today regarding the alteration of a public document by Dan Reeves, acting with apparent coordination with the claimant, will be referred to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for investigation of fraudulent tampering with public records." He looked directly at Gerald Sloan. "Mr. Sloan, the court is aware that you personally did not access the county records. However, the pattern of events presented today, the coordination between the document alteration, the debt acceleration, and the boundary filing suggests a degree of planning that the prosecutor will wish to examine." He paused. "You would be well advised to secure independent legal counsel. Mr. Patterson's firm represents interests that may be in conflict with yours before this is concluded." Patterson went very still. Gerald Sloan looked at his lawyer. His lawyer did not look back at him. And that, Margaret thought, was the moment Gerald Sloan understood that he was alone in this room, in a way he had never been alone before, that the network of association and favor, an implied threat, that had made him large in this valley for 20 years, had just revealed itself to be made of something thinner than he knew. The gavel came down. The room exhaled. People began moving, speaking the immediate noise of a crowd released from stillness, and Margaret sat for a moment and let the sound wash over her and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. The ranch was safe. The wells were safe. The boundary was established. Gerald Sloan was in the most legally precise sense finished. She felt Thomas beside her before she saw him, his particular presence, the warmth and solidity of it, the thing she had been aware of for weeks without letting herself catalog. He sat down in the seat next to her. The room was emptying around them. "It's over," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Margaret Ellis," he said. She waited. "It's an ordinary day," he said. She blinked. He was looking at her with that expression she had learned, the one that was not the controlled blankness and not the careful neutrality, but the real thing underneath the face that had been there all along and was simply not hidden anymore. "There's no crisis," he said. "The land is settled. Gerald Sloan is someone else's problem. It is a completely ordinary Thursday in September in Millhaven, Montana." He paused. "And I want you to stay." The courthouse was almost empty now. Caleb and Henry were near the door talking to Archer. Robert Vance was speaking to Calvin across the room. The ordinary sounds of ordinary people on an ordinary Thursday. She looked at Thomas Whitaker. She thought of the stagecoach, of picking up her own suitcase before he moved, of the kitchen at 4 a.m, and the ledger on his desk, and Harlan Cole's face when she named the clause he'd forgotten. She thought of the baby she'd walked to sleep in the middle of a storm, and the iron marker in the ground that had been waiting 15 years for someone to need it. She thought of the open suitcase against the wall of her room, and all the morning she had dressed in the dark and gone to the kitchen without unpacking it, holding herself in the careful suspension of a woman who has been disappointed enough times that hope requires evidence. She had the evidence now. "Yes," she said. Just that. No preamble, no cushion. The same directness she'd used her whole life turned now towards something she wanted instead of something she was defending. Thomas looked at her for a moment, like a man who has been braced for a longer answer and is recalibrating. Then he reached out and took her hand. In the middle of the courthouse, in front of whoever was left to see it. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. Caleb from across the room absolutely saw and looked immediately at the ceiling with the elaborate nonchalance of a young man, exercising heroic self-control. Henry saw and turned back to his conversation with Archer without missing a beat, though there was something in the set of his shoulders that looked, if you knew him, very much like satisfaction. They rode home in the afternoon light, the whole group of them, and the mood was the particular mood that follows the resolution of something that has been heavy, not loud, not celebratory in the way of festivities, but light, the specific lightness of people who have been carrying something and have set it down. Archer fell asleep in the wagon again. Caleb had given up pretending he wasn't grinning. Calvin Ridge rode beside Thomas, and they talked quietly about the prosecutor's timeline, about what came next in the legal process, about the details that would need attending. Because resolution is never a door that closes all at once. It's a series of smaller closings, each one a little quieter than the last. Margaret rode beside the wagon and felt the September afternoon on her face and did not think about anything in particular. She let herself simply be here, in this place, on this road, going home. When they got back to the ranch, she went directly to the kitchen, because that was what she did, because some habits are so deep, they're not habits anymore, they're just who you are. And she started supper. Clara was already there, had anticipated, had the stove going and the water on, and was looking at Margaret with bright eyes and the barely contained energy of someone who has heard news and is waiting to be told it officially. "Well," Clara said. "We won," Margaret said. Clara made a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a sob, then collected herself with the dignity of a 15-year-old who had decided she was more mature than that and turned back to the stove. "I started the beans," she said. "Good girl," Margaret said. She tied on her apron. She began to cook. The supper that night was not formally special. No announcement, no ceremony, none of the deliberate marking of occasion that the moment might have invited. It was simply supper at the Whitaker Ranch. 9 men at the table and Clara helping and Margaret at the stove, and the food was good and the conversation was loud, and Archer, who had decided to stay another night because the alternative was a 12-mile ride on a bad hip, held the table captive for 20 minutes with a story about a surveying dispute in Colorado in 1871 that had ended with a fistfight, a mule, and the complete destruction of a general store. Thomas laughed. Margaret was at the stove, and she heard it, a real laugh, uncalculated, the laugh of a man who is entirely present in a moment. And she turned just long enough to see his face open and alive and young in a way she hadn't seen before, and she turned back to the stove before anyone noticed she was looking. After supper, after the table was cleared, and Clara had gone home, and the ranch hands had drifted to the bunkhouse, and Archer had retired with his bad hip and his extraordinary memory, the house went quiet. The good quiet. The quiet Margaret had been learning to distinguish from the other kind. Not the held breath quiet of a place that had stopped, but the settled quiet of a place at rest. Thomas came to the kitchen. He sat at the small table. She poured him coffee without being asked, and set it in front of him, and sat down across from him. And for a while, they were simply 2 people at a table in the evening, which was the most ordinary thing in the world, and felt right now like the most extraordinary. "I need to tell you something," Thomas said. She waited. When Eleanor died, he said, "I stopped believing the ranch was a home. I told myself it was a business. I told myself that was cleaner, that if it was just land and cattle and money, the rest of it couldn't hurt me anymore." He looked at his coffee. "I believed that for 3 years. And now," she said. He looked up. "Now I think I was wrong about almost everything I believed for 3 years," he said. "And I think you probably knew that the first night you sat in this kitchen." "No," she said. "Not the first night. Maybe the second." His mouth curved. "Margaret," he said. "Thomas, I would like to ask you something properly." He reached into his breast pocket. "I've been carrying this since Monday. I bought it from the jeweler in Millhaven while Calvin was at the records office. Henry saw me go in and had the profound self-restraint not to say a word about it until I was ready. He set a small ring on the table between them. Plain gold, simple and clean. I know you said an ordinary day. I believe this qualifies. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. Thomas Whitaker, she said. Margaret Ellis, he said. You are the most stubborn, difficult, guarded man I have met in 32 years of living, she said. You showed me your worst face on the first day, and your best face every day since, and I am fully aware that in a better world I would make you work significantly harder for this. He was watching her with complete attention. But, he said, but I am 32 years old, and I am tired of waiting for a better world, she said, and I would like very much to unpack my suitcase. He picked up the ring. He looked at her. Is that a yes? He said. That is absolutely a yes, she said. He reached across the table and took her hand and put the ring on her finger, and the metal was cool for a moment, and then it was warm the way things become warm when they find the place they belong. She looked at it. She looked at him. I'm going to be difficult, she said. I'm going to see things you miss and tell you about them even when you don't want to hear it. I'm going to run this kitchen and these accounts, and I'm going to be right about things in a way that is occasionally inconvenient. I'm counting on it, he said. I snore, she said. He blinked. A little, she said. I've been told. He started laughing, that real laugh again, the one that had no performance in it, and she started laughing too, the way you laugh when you've been holding your breath for a long time and have finally been given permission to breathe. She went to her room that night with the ring on her finger and the lamp low and the Montana night enormous outside the window. She opened the suitcase. She began to unpack. She set each thing in its place. The folded clothes, the small book of recipes in her mother's handwriting that she'd carried for 15 years, the photograph of her mother's house in Missouri, the dried lavender sachet that had been in every room she'd ever lived in. She set them all down in this room, in this house, and each thing she placed felt like a word in a sentence she was finally being allowed to finish. She was not temporary. She was not a guest. She was not the woman people tolerated until something better came along. She was Margaret Ellis Whitaker. Not yet, not on paper. Not for a few more months, but already in the sense that mattered most, already in the sense of a person who has found the place where she is fully, completely herself and is not going anywhere. The suitcase was empty. She folded it flat and slid it under the bed where it could stay until she needed it for something else, because this was the last room she was going to arrive at with her heart wrapped up like she was ready to leave on 5 minutes' notice. She was done leaving. She was home. In the morning, she was up before dawn. She went to the kitchen. She built the fire from the banked coals. She put the coffee on. She started the biscuits. She heard the back door, the particular sound of it, the slight catch in the latch that she had never gotten around to fixing, because she had come to think of it as the ranch's way of announcing itself, and Thomas came in jacket, not yet on hair, not yet entirely organized, looking like a man who had slept better than he had in years, and was slightly surprised by it. He sat at the small table. She poured his coffee. She set it in front of him. He looked at the ring on her hand as she pulled back. He looked at her face. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She went back to the biscuits. Outside the ranch was waking the sound of the men, the horses, the slow gathering momentum of a working day beginning. The sky through the window was going from black to blue, to the particular gold pink of a Montana dawn, the kind of sky that looks like something that should be witnessed. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what I thought the first morning I came in and found you already at the stove?" "What?" she said. "I thought she's going to leave," he said. "The moment she gets a real look at this place and what it costs to stay here, she's going to get back on the next stage to Missouri." She turned around. He was watching her with that open face, the real one. "Every morning after that," he said, "I came in here wondering if today was the day you'd decide it wasn't worth it." She looked at him. "Thomas," she said. "Yeah. I unpacked my suitcase last night." He was quiet. "I know," he said. "How do you know?" "Because I walked past the door and the light was on. he said. And I stood in the hall for a minute, and then I went to bed and slept straight through till morning. He paused. First time in 3 years. She turned back to the biscuits. Her eyes were doing something she was not going to acknowledge at 5 o'clock in the morning in front of a man she had just agreed to marry. She pressed the cutter down, turned it, lifted it clean. Row after row after row. The biscuits went in the oven. The coffee was hot. The ranch moved and breathed outside the window, and Margaret Ellis stood in her kitchen in the Whitaker Ranch in Montana Territory on an ordinary Friday morning in September of 1884, with a gold ring on her finger and an empty suitcase under her bed, and a man at her table who had made a mistake on the first day and had spent every day since making it right, and she understood with complete and absolute certainty the thing she had always known was true, but had never before been given proof of. A woman is not defined by the first look someone gives her. She is defined by every choice she makes after that look, and whether she keeps walking anyway, and whether she keeps her hands moving, and her head up, and her heart open, even when the world gives her every reason to close it. Margaret Ellis had kept walking. She had kept her hands moving. She had kept her heart open. And the life she had built from that stubbornness in this kitchen, on this ranch, in this valley, with this man, was not something the world had handed her. It was something she had made, with her own 2 flour-dusted, work-worn, capable hands. And it was hers, completely and permanently and without apology. Hers.